Okay, welcome to another Speeduino guide, and today in front of the car, because we have to look at the engine and more specifically the timing, and checking our base timing is one of the most important things that you have to do on a freshly, converted engine that you converted to Speeduino, or if you have, for example, changed your spark setup, then I would also suggest checking it once over so that you know everything is running good. In addition to checking the base timing, we also want to get the car running at idle. So maybe if your car is not running correctly at idle, I would suggest you skip to the later part of this video where I show you how to get the car running correctly on idle, and then check your base timing if you are alone, for example, and don't have somebody that can hold the gas pedal so that the car idles correctly. If your car is not running and you still want to check the timing, this is also possible. You just do the same thing I am going to show you, but just when the engine is cranking. And yeah, that's basically it. And I'm going to show you how to do that exactly. Okay, so first of all, what you need for adjusting the base timing of your engine. You need a timing light like this one. You can get the cheapest one you can find. They work fine, and they're like 20 bucks. You need your laptop to be connected. I am capturing this again on the laptop so you see what I am doing exactly. And yeah, I'm just first gonna show you how to set up the timing light. You have two clamps, so these ones, this one goes to the positive battery terminal, this one goes to the negative or somewhere on the chassis, which is ground, and then you have this one, which is an inductive clamp, and that goes at the cable or wiring harness of the first cylinder. As you can see, my timing light is lit up. If you don't have a display on that or whatever, don't worry, you don't need that to work. It's just a bit fancier one that the normal ones. And I'm gonna hook up the inductor, and that's how you hook up your timing light. Then we are going to set something up in Tunerstudio. Because the engine, obviously, because of the spark table, would in theory fluctuate around depending on map value and RPM. On the timing advance, we are going to fix that at a steady 10 degrees. That is done through the spark settings, and then enable fixed locked timing on, and then set that to 10 degrees. Or something that is on your timing cover, or so there is a timing cover on your engine, like near the crank pulley, that should show you some timing values. That should be looking something like this. This is from Miata, and then here you can see different markings. For example, we have a 10-degree mark and a TDC mark. If you do not have any markings on your pulley, pull out one of your spark plugs or look at the TDC markings on your timing belt and put cylinder 1 at top dead center. And then put a marking onto your crank pulley and somewhere on the same spot on the plastics of your timing belt cover. And then you can set the fixed timing that I just set to 10 degrees, set that to 0, and then just aim for that marking you set while the engine is running. Okay, then you start your engine. In my case, I cannot really show you how it's working, so I will just show you from somebody else pictures or a video that will explain what I'm doing as well. So I will start the engine right now. Ignore the weird clicking sound, that is my idle air control valve. So, okay, if you have hooked up your timing light, then in my case it already shows the RPM of the engine. I hooked it up to the second one because the first one was kind of buggy at mine, but you need to hook it up at the first one. I just want to show you how it looks. it shows the RPM of the engine in my case, and if I press the trigger, it fires the light at the same speed of the engine. Okay, and if you point it at the crank pulley, it should show you the marking at the ignition angle you are or you should have right now, and then by adjusting in the trigger setup the trigger angle, you can change the ignition angle that you are seeing, and there you can adjust it so that it is at the correct point where you need it. Okay, back in the car. So for the next part we want to get the car running at idle at least. So we will do obviously some idle and cold start tuning later in some different part, but well, you need your car to idle, and yeah, cold start is something you have to try around a bit yourself. I already said that in my base settings episodes, so that's something you have to try out yourself. But I can tell you, or I can show you how to set your idle. First of all, the easiest method, if you are, for example, not running an idle air control valve, would be with your idle screw on your throttle body, which most of throttle bodies should have. And with that you can set your base idle and especially also your idle in general. As I said, if you're running not an idle air control valve, though I would highly recommend you do that. So how do you do that? So that's not going to be done within Tunerstudio, so because it's just analog, let's say it that way, and you will just set that screw to whatever RPM you desire. The issue with that is that once the engine is warmed up, your idle will rise about 200 to 400 RPM, which you have to compensate somehow. So if you would, for example, start your car at 0 degrees Celsius, it may run at 800 RPM, while when the car is fully warmed up, because the resistances within the engine are going to be lower, the engine might run at 1200 or even more RPM. And there's a thing in Tunerstudio that you can use to kind of compensate that, and that would be within the idle and start settings, the idle advanced setting. Here you can set this to added, and if you set that to added, then you can set or can add or subtract ignition timing to your idle, and therefore somewhat regulate your idle speed. I'm gonna demonstrate that without this feature right now. So I'm using my stock idle, or I'm using my open loop configuration, so I have a preset value of my duty cycle of the idle air control valve. Let's maybe put that down a bit. So we are at 800 and, well, 50 RPM. And if I now want to, let's say, up my idle by a few RPM, the issue is that RPM drop or RPM gain is not going to be as much as, for example, with the idle air control valve, so you are kind of limited in that range. And if I'm running 10 degrees now, which you also can see here, my current timing advance, if I, for example, want to raise my idle, then my RPM goes up to about 1050. The issue with that is, or I could go also lower, if I, for example, would select like 5 degrees, then my idle would go down to 850. And if I select my 10 again, I would go back to 900. While the issue with that is that you can vary the idle speed by about 200 RPM. This is not going to cover the whole range of operations. So, for example, if your car is cold and you run 900 RPM with the relatively high advance, so like 20 degrees or something, the issue then is when you activate your interior fan, for example, your lights or whatever, then that RPM is still going to drop. So that is an issue you cannot tune around with without an idle air control valve. And this is where the second method comes in, using an idle air control valve, or you could also use an N75 or some other method of valve that is pulsed, for example. Then there would be the method of the open loop control, which is under idle control. I selected that right now, the open loop control, which in my mind is the best to use on a not a daily car, because on a daily it cannot really compensate that much. So for air conditioning, for example, that's maybe a point where you cannot get a real stable RPM. So that's something you might look into closed loop control, but for cars without AC or something, that might be an option. And then you can see the settings you have here. In my case, I'm using an N75 valve for the idle control. That's why it's also sounding so weird. But that's the settings I'm going to use. Normally, you would have a frequency of about 500 Hertz or so. But because I'm using a different valve, it is a lower frequency. That's also depending on your valve itself. And then I can control my PWM duty cycle. This is how much of a time window in basically in a second or in a minute the valve is open. So in this case, if I have selected 50 here, it is going to be 50% at a time, or at of that time it's going to be open. So 50% open time, I guess. And the good thing is here that you can select the temperature range. So you can compensate for cold start and cold temperatures, cold coolant temperatures, etc. And you have to try around with that now. Depending on your valve, you might get a working range from 20 to 80%, and some valves don't work above or below that, and some might only work between 20 and 40% or 20 and 60, although that kind of varies between valves. But then you can put in your values here that you want, and then control your idle that way. For example, if I demonstrate that, if I run my idle valve at like 50%, then I have an RPM of about 700. And obviously, if I pull up the percentage, my idle is going to increase. And this is pretty simple. You can just select the correct values so that you achieve the desired RPM you want. And therefore, you can adjust your idle according to your coolant temperature. And then there's a different point, which is PWM cranking duty cycle, so that your idle air control valve opens for a specified amount of time when you are cranking. Here it is recommended to use a bit more, about 10 to 20% more than your running duty cycle, because most of engines do like it when a bit comes in during start. And this is why mine also, if you look at the RPM, when I start, it climbs up and goes down for a bit. And this helps the car run a bit better when it's starting, so it doesn't die. And it, in most of the cases I had before, works pretty well. If you want that decrease of RPM, for example, after you started, and the decrease to your running RPM or your running duty cycle be a bit shorter, you can select the crank to run taper here, and if you put that down to like 0.5, then that obviously will be shorter. That's basically the idle control for open loop. Now you can use that in correlation with the idle advance. So if you, for example, are obviously using lights or whatever, then you can still use the idle advance to correct for you, basically, for example, adding your in-cabin fan or your lights. You can compensate for that by upping the RPM or upping the ignition advance for somewhat, like for example, if I put 10 degrees in here, when the RPM reaches 200 RPM below your target, then, so if I put in 200 here, then if the RPM dips 200 RPM below your target, it's going to add this amount of timing. And obviously on the right side you have your desired RPMs. This can be pretty good and can work pretty good if you are using open loop control, as long as you don't use huge energy sucking components such as AC, because with AC that is not going to work that well. You will probably going to be needing the idle up value, and there you can set a pin. If that pin sees 12 volt, or if that pin sees voltage, you can tell the ECU to add a certain amount of PWM duty cycle to your idle air control valve to basically compensate for that device turning on. For example, on AC, it's going to be like 5% or 10% of the PWM duty cycle that it needs to increase to keep the RPM steady. So that would be a possibility to use for open loop control. Then there's the last and most complicated thing, which would be closed loop control. And this is something that I recommend for advanced users, because I wasn't even able to finish the whole programming process of this yet. I still have to find out some things about that, because it is kind of complicated, but this lets the ECU choose itself based on what RPM it is and what RPM are you desiring. So if I have my RPM target open here, then I can tell the ECU, yeah, I want 950 RPM basically at 70 degrees onwards, and the ECU is going to target this RPM, and it is going to control the duty cycle itself by using the PID algorithm. PID is kind of difficult to tune sometimes. On this ECU, unfortunately, I have not found it out how to get it working correctly. You can obviously copy my values here, but I am not exactly sure if they are correct or if they are somewhere in the neighborhood of correct, so don't quote me on these. And you can set a maximum and minimum duty cycle for your valve, because as I said, some valves only work above like 20% or something, so you can put that up or down depending on where your valve works. So the ECU doesn't shut off the valve although you need it to be on. So, and yeah, that's basically the most important or the best way to get that working, if you can get it working. And that can compensate for AC without any problems, because the ECU does it automatically, although it has to be set up correctly to do it. If I start my engine now and you look at my RPM, okay, so I have targeted 950, and the ECU is now trying to reach that by increasing the duty cycle manually or automatically. And they can see we've almost reached 950 RPM, which is good. So that works. But on some instances with those settings and a drive, it's not really working that well, and sometimes it dips below. And as you can see, it sometimes dips above that as well. So it's not optimal. Especially when I put on or I turn on some accessories. Well, let's wait until it gets back down to 950 again. So if I turn on my fan and my lights, it dips down and only slowly recovers to its base 950 or to my desired RPM. So that is kind of complicated to set up, and I'm going to put a link in my description to show you what the PID algorithm actually is and how it works. So that explanation is pretty much the best I could find on YouTube. And that's how you basically control the PID algorithm. And yes, that will work. I have had that working on an MS3 unit and it was perfect, basically the same as stock. So that would be a possibility to use, and it is possible to get it working right. I just haven't gotten it right to work on Speeduino yet. Other things. Again, this is it for idle tuning, and there are obviously some other things as cranking, or rather the cold startup, or cold start settings or cranking settings. I will cover those in a different video because, well, the engine isn't cold yet, or isn't cold now. I'll probably be looking at that at the end, and yeah, because that's one thing that is kind of complicated to tune and very specific on the car and on your setup. So that's it basically for setting base ignition timing and also for setting your idle. And I hoped you like it. The last few parts were you liked very much, so I appreciate all the feedback and all the likes I got. So I will obviously continue this series, and I hope you also liked this part as much as you did the last one. Again, if you have any questions, leave that in the comments below or send me a message on Instagram. Also, if you need any tuning services done, let me know there. And yeah, that's basically it. I wish you all the best and have a nice day. Bye.